From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Wednesday, December 17th, 2014. On today's show, we'll hear from Max Blumenthal, author of Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. Just months after the brutal 51-day Israeli war on Gaza, Blumenthal reveals the devastation wreaked on Gaza, how Palestinians are surviving, and what the U.S.'s responsibility is. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Courtney Morris. She is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. Hi, Courtney.
Good morning, Sonali.
Burials are underway for the 132 Pakistani children killed in a horrifying attack on a school in Peshawar. Members of a Taliban group have taken credit for the armed attack, which is being considered the deadliest such attack in Pakistan's history. Today kicks off a 3-day period of national mourning in Pakistan. Meanwhile, Army Chief General Raul Sharif is in Afghanistan today to enlist the help of Afghan President Ashraf Ghani to present a united front against the Taliban. General John F. Campbell of the joint U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan is also meeting with the Pakistani official. It is thought that Taliban forces involved in the attack have sanctuary inside Afghanistan, which shares a long, porous border with Pakistan. Now, Courtney, both the Pakistani army and Afghanistan's government have long made overtures to the Taliban. Even the U.S. has been accused of fomenting a situation in which the Taliban has thrived. How then can officials from these three countries be expected to take any action to prevent such tragedies in the future?
Well, that's a fair point, Sonali, and I think it's one that probably many Pakistani civilians right now who are grieving today share. But I think that this school killing is going to have ramifications for the place of the Taliban in both Afghanistan and in Pakistan in their political cultures. And the fact of the matter is Ashraf Ghani campaigned on a platform of helping to eradicate the Taliban in Afghanistan. And just last month, he lifted the ban on night raids on Taliban militants, which wasn't a measure that many people in his country approved of, but that's a step that he has been taking. And so he's demonstrated that, he's a career technocrat, so he's prepared to work with the United States to try to bring the Taliban down, even though people might take exception with some of the methods that invariably are going to be used in that campaign. In Pakistan, I think it's a bit more complicated. The system of corruption and state collusion with paramilitary actors is much more expensive and much more difficult to unravel for a variety of reasons. But somebody has to answer for these dead school children. And so I think in the short term, we will definitely see a response from the state. Just this morning, they announced that the government has lifted the death penalty, the ban on the death penalty that had been in place. So we are going to see some measures, I think, of people trying to crack down. But the question is really, in the long term, are they going to be able to transform these cultures of political corruption and collusion with paramilitary actors?
And Cuba has agreed to free Alan Gross, an American contractor held a prisoner in a Cuban military hospital for 5 years over alleged spying on behalf of the U.S. government. The move is part of a prisoner swap agreement with the U.S., which will free the last 3 of the so-called Cuban 5 prisoners. The Cuban 5 were arrested and imprisoned in the U.S. more than a decade ago and accused of being spies. In fact, they were part of a Cuban counterintelligence program aimed at undermining U.S.-based attacks on Cuba. 2 of the 5 have served their terms and were released over the past year. The last 3 will now be returned to Cuba. According to the U.S. news reports, the White House is indicating the beginning of new talks on everything, from travel restrictions to eventual lifting of the Cuban embargo. Courtney, this seems like very good news for those interested in U.S.-Cuba relations, is it?
Well, I think it's definitely a positive step. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the embargo it's completely exhaustive and untenable. And there are a number of people, particularly Cuban citizens, who would like to be able to go home, to be able to move more freely between the United States and Cuba to support their families. And we've seen some of those steps, for example, with the opening up of remittances for Cubans who are living in the United States who want to be able to send money. So that's something that we've seen the Obama administration making gestures towards from the beginning. But this is really a hugely important step. It's hugely important because it's also a negotiation of the end to the embargo that recognizes the extent to which the United States has played some really dirty tricks in its battle with Cuba. I was thinking this morning just about the case of Los Aldeanos, who were caught up in a scheme with the USAID to create, to destabilize the Castro administration in Cuba. And so I think that as more and more of these kinds of stories come to light, and we recognize how entrenched this pattern of espionage has been, that it becomes less and less tenable to justify upholding the embargo.
And finally, President Obama last night quietly signed a $1.1 trillion spending measure passed by both houses of Congress. The measure will ensure that all but one government departments are fully funded through next September. The Department of Homeland Security will need to renew its funding in February, a setup for a fight over the president's executive action on immigration. The bill was opposed by some Democrats because it weakens part of the already weak financial reform law known as the Dodd-Frank bill and possibly extends the public bailout of corporations engaged in risky trading. Senator Elizabeth Warren in particular raised her voice against the bill, even as she quashed rumors that she might run for president. Incidentally, former Florida Governor Jeb Bush has just announced his sights for the Republican presidential ticket. Well, Courtney, in terms of kowtowing to Wall Street, does it even matter who the president is? I mean, Clinton, Obama, Bush, they all bow down to big business, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly that's true. And I mean, if there are any differences to be found at all, it's merely a question of degree and the extent to which they will perform dissenting or that they will perform that having some kind of disagreement with the corporate sector. But at the end of the day, the fact of the matter is that corporations run politics in this country, and no matter what people say in public, whatever the discourse might be, when it comes time to make decisions around legislation, we can see very clearly that the state is not going to go after the private sector.
Well, Courtney Morris, always a pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you again next week.
Hi, Sonali.
Courtney Morris is an assistant professor of African American and Women's Studies at Penn State University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. A Jordanian-backed UN Security Council resolution today called for an end to Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories. Jordan is currently serving on the Security Council. Predictably, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry indicated the U.S. would veto the resolution. But momentum is mounting worldwide. A day earlier, Kerry had met with Palestinian officials in London, eager to lay the foundations of a Palestinian state. And on the same day, the European Parliament voted resoundingly to recognize a Palestinian state. Nearly 500 parliamentarians voted in favor of it, with only 88 voting against it. The vote is, of course, symbolic. Meanwhile, clashes continue in West Bank, with Israeli soldiers killing a Palestinian man last night, prompting Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas to call for an end to, quote, Israeli crimes against unarmed Palestinians. We turn today to Max Blumenthal. He's an award-winning journalist and best-selling author. His articles and video documentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Daily Beast, The Nation, Electronic Intifada, Salon.com, Al Jazeera English, and many other publications. He's a writing fellow for the Nation Institute. He also blogs at Al Akbar English. And his book, Republican Gomorrah, Inside the Movement That Shattered the Party, became a New York Times and a Los Angeles Times bestseller. In this past year, his new book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel, took on the crisis in the occupied territories. In October, Blumenthal gave a lecture at the Lannan Foundation where he was introduced by Democracy Now! Host Amy Goodman. During his speech, Max laid out the extent of the devastation that Israel wrought during its 51-day war this past summer in Gaza. He had traveled there to witness the impact of the war. Here is an excerpt of his speech.
The Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles, the hate group, has attacked not only the Russell Tribunal, but has smeared Bertrand Russell himself as an anti-Semite. It's too bad he's not around to defend himself, but this is the level that they've stooped to. And, you know, during my book tour, the Simon Wiesenthal Center named me the #9 anti-Israel, anti-Semite. This was after Louis Gohmert, Representative Louis Gohmert, not exactly the sharpest tool in the toolbox, attacked me. This is an evangelical Christian, attacked me as an anti-Semite on the House floor. You know, so I was proud to have my name read into the congressional record. But I was number 9 on this list. It was incredible. And my mother was Shepping Nachas. My mother was proud because I was tied with Alice Walker, one of just behind number 8 European sports venues. I got to do better. And you know, as an American Jew, I strive to do my best, so I'm trying to get to number 1, but I have stiff competition because number 1 was Ayatollah Khomeini. It was, you know, an interesting moment for me to wind up on this list. It made me reflect. Being here with you right now makes me reflect on how I got here and where we are. And I thought of another Max who took a totally different course than me, but who also grew up sort of in the mainstream of Jewish American life. His name was Max Steinberg. He was 24 years old, and he was killed in combat in the Gaza Strip with the Golani Brigade, with an elite unit in the Golani Brigade. He was invading the Gaza Strip in Shujaiya, an area that was completely destroyed. He was essentially terrorizing occupied Palestinians. Max Steinberg grew up in a major metropolitan area like I did. I grew up in D.C. He grew up in Los Angeles, and he was radicalized in a synagogue in Woodland Hills, and radicalized through various pro-Israel programs. He signed up as a young man to become a foreign fighter, a Jewish jihadist, if you will, for the state of Israel, to join a foreign army that maintains a brutal occupation. John Kerry, it's tragic. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, appeared at the funeral of Max Steinberg, the foreign fighter, and said that he stands in awe of this young man who went to fight for a foreign army. This young man who went to fight for the Jewish state in Israel and the Levant, or JSIL, while John Kerry calls for war on the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, a force that is largely comprised or partially comprised of young Muslim men who were radicalized in the West and enlisted as foreign fighters to commit acts of ethnic cleansing. I grew up in D.C., and as I went to Hebrew school and grew up, there were attempts to radicalize me, to make me a supporter of JSIL, the Jewish state. If you grow up as a Jewish American in middle-class life in the United States, Zionism calls on you, and you have to decide. And it was when I was 22 and I had just gotten out of college that I finally decided to take one of these free trips to Israel, the Birthright Israel trip, where young American Jews are radicalized and recruited for the Jewish state. It didn't work out for me the way they wanted. Now, the funders of Birthright Israel, like Sheldon Adelson, who also happens to be one of the largest funders of the Republican Party and of Benjamin Netanyahu, say that they aim to accomplish 2 things. Number 1, they want to prevent assimilation, in other words, intermarriage. So it's the ultimate Jewish sex vacation. I didn't participate in that aspect at the time. Maybe I have some regrets, I don't know. But the second aspect is to build a lifelong connection between you and Israel. And in that sense, it did work on me. The problem is, it didn't work the way they wanted. It planted the seeds of doubt in my mind. I knew something was being hidden from me. And when I returned to my everyday life in Los Angeles, I started following the Israel-Palestine crisis. It's not a conflict. If anything, it's a conquest. I started following it more closely than ever. The Second Intifada had just begun. And I watched as the Israeli Air Force dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on an apartment block in Gaza City in order to kill one Hamas operative, Salah Shahada, knowing that his entire family and 13 other families were inside. Scores were injured, children and women were killed, and the head of the Israeli Air Force shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, we did it. What are you going to do? Jenin happened. The Jenin refugee camp was destroyed, and I watched with horror as the center of the camp was literally bulldozed. And I started going out to forums at synagogues held by supposedly liberal groups like Americans for Peace Now. And I noticed that the liberal Zionists had joined ranks with the right-wing Zionists. And the only debate was what size cage Palestinians should live in, a regular or jumbo-size cage. I noticed there was no real debate. And I wondered, where were the moderate Jews to condemn this radicalism? Where were the moderate Jews to condemn the violence of the state of Israel? I couldn't find them in my community. And so I felt alone. And I embarked on a long process of trying to figure out where I fit in and how I could approach this issue in good conscience as a humane person who'd been raised as a liberal by a family that told me to respect equality and these basic issues of fairness. How could I be a Jew and be a Zionist and still be a humane person? I had to square all these things. Getting information at this time was extremely hard. The internet was not a place, it wasn't what it is now. You didn't have websites like Mondo Weiss and Electronic Intifada that you could turn to for a really critical perspective. All I had at that time, actually, was Democracy Now! And I was listening to Amy, and I was listening to the correspondents she had in the West Bank, who were young people just like me, being shot at by the Israeli military, trying to cover human rights abuses. And it changed me to hear these reports. I was hearing about Rachel Corrie, the young woman from Olympia, Washington, who was my age, who was crushed by an Israeli bulldozer as she tried to make a stand in front of her friend's home in Rafah in the occupied Gaza Strip. I heard about Tom Herndl, who was a young man from the United Kingdom who was shot in the head and killed by an Israeli sniper, also in the Gaza Strip. I'd never considered that there were young people just like me who were going to Palestine and laying their bodies on the line against the occupation. And I saw them attacked in our media as lunatics. And I knew that they must have been sane. The doubts were growing inside me. I remember Amy covering a pro-choice rally in Washington, and she interviewed Howard Dean. And she asked Howard Dean, out of left field, do you support Israeli assassinations of Palestinian leaders? And Howard Dean did not know how to respond, and then immediately he turned to the AIPAC line and said, yes, I do. Israel has a right to defend itself, almost like an automaton. Because he was becoming a presidential frontrunner. That introduced me to the concept of the PEP, the Progressive Except for Palestine. Someone who I was so disappointed because I was really invigorated by Howard Dean representing the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party when I heard him say this. And it occurred to me that there were so many people, particularly in Jewish American life, who supported abortion rights and were ready to go to the barricades for gay rights, who were environmentally conscious and shopped for free-range chicken at the local farmer's market, but weren't particularly comfortable with free-range Palestinians. Where did I fit in? The alienation was growing, and the process continued. Over the years, I was trying to find a community of people who shared my views on this issue, of Jews who shared my views, and of Palestinians. The breaking point came with Operation Cast Lead, which Amy discussed in the beginning. It was this punishing assault on the besieged Gaza Strip in 2008-2009 by the Israeli military that left over 1,400 dead. It seemed like it would never end. It lasted for 3 weeks, and I remember watching it right around the time when the live stream of Al Jazeera English came online. So I was able to get an alternative perspective for the first time from a 24/7 media outlet. And this really shocked me. I felt something break inside me, and I decided that, I was going to use my journalistic talents and energy to present another perspective on this issue. I was going to throw my weight into this without fear, without apology, and see what happened. And I knew that I would be insulated from a lot of the criticism that others have received, people like Stephen Walt or John Mearsheimer or Jimmy Carter, because they're not Jewish. So I embarked on my first trip to Israel-Palestine without knowing a single person there, and I contacted some of the Jewish Israeli leftists who were wielding their bodies against the occupation and facing enormous castigation from their own society, and they opened up an entire world to me. So Goliath began. The work on Goliath began soon after Operation Cast Lead and right after Israel elected the most right-wing government in its history, with Benjamin Netanyahu at the helm, pushed by the right, by Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who favored the transfer of 250,000 Palestinian citizens of Israel, who favored mass ethnic cleansing. What I found inside Israel-Palestine, aside from this incredible group of dissidents, aside from these brave Palestinian farmers in the West Bank who went out every Friday to protest the occupation without arms, who were taken off to military prisons at night, put on trial, and disappeared for months. What I found was an entire society, Jewish Israeli society, where the majority of people were determined to finish the job, were weary of the occupation, and wanted a society without Palestinians. That's why they had elected Netanyahu. That's why they were supporting Lieberman. And that's why every week in the Knesset there was a new racist or anti-democratic law. It's why the Israeli Supreme Court authorized the Citizenship and Entry Law, which prevents Palestinians from inside Israel from marrying or reuniting with family members in the West Bank. Meanwhile, I, an American Jew, solely on the basis of my J-positive blood, could emigrate to Israel tomorrow and marry anyone I wanted, whether they're a settler in the West Bank or someone from inside Israel proper. That was clear apartheid to me. I saw the Prover plan unfold, a plan out in the open, which was a blueprint for the forced removal of 80,000 indigenous Bedouin who were citizens of the State of Israel. And I visited the village of Al-Arakib, an unrecognized Bedouin village, spent the night there, and in the morning watched the village wiped off the map. It was the third time it's been wiped off the map, and since that visit, it has been bulldozed and destroyed 73 times in order to build an unnatural forest in the desert and a Jews-only community, sponsored by the Jewish National Fund, one of the top 501c3 nonprofits in the United States. I found a matrix of control based on demographic separation and the engineering of a Jewish demographic majority in order to preserve and maintain the State of Israel's ethnic purity, embodied in the separation wall, 638 kilometers of concrete cutting deep into the West Bank, the walls surrounding the Gaza Strip, a besieged population quarantined from the rest of the world. I found that the separation regime, what the Israelis call hafrada, clear policy of separating people based on ethnic and religious lines, had had a terrible effect on young people in Jewish society in Israel. While young American Jews are turning against the occupation in droves and developing critical attitudes on the State of Israel, young Jews in Israel are turning more right-wing than ever. And so that every year, the Israeli Democracy Institute, which conducts the most comprehensive and authoritative poll of Jewish Israeli attitudes, showed a majority of young Jewish Israelis declaring their refusal to sit in a classroom with an Arab citizen of Israel, refusing to live next door to an Arab, a majority of Israelis supporting the use of violent force in order to remove non-Jewish African refugees from Israeli society, a plurality of Israelis declaring support for internment camps for Arabs during wartime in Israel. Poll after poll showing rising racist attitudes and militaristic attitudes, a product of an education system which is cultivating young minds to be good soldiers, not good citizens, and ultimately the effect of growing up tragically in the only active settler colonial state in the world. The post-Oslo generation of Israelis is more right-wing than ever, and their attitudes grow more right-wing each year. And those attitudes were carried in to the war that I'm going to describe to you. The most severe iteration of this right-wing government and of the separation regime that it's imposed on Palestinians is, of course, the siege of Gaza. Now, what is the Gaza Strip? The Gaza Strip is a small coastal enclave that borders Egypt and the State of Israel, which is surrounded by electrified fencing, concrete walls, sentry towers, and remote-controlled machine guns by land, and an Israeli naval cordon by sea. The population depends entirely on the State of Israel to allow it to receive its basic necessities. Former Israeli government advisor Dov Weissglass said that we will not allow the population of Gaza to starve, we'll simply put it on a diet, which is why Israeli administrators from the Defense Ministry literally count the calories through complex mathematical equations that each resident of the Gaza Strip is enabled to receive under the siege regime. The people in Gaza live in the second most densely populated area on Earth, and that's because most of them are refugees. 80% of them are refugees. They previously had land and homes inside what is known as Israel. They are ghettoized permanently because they're not allowed to return to Israel. They can't return to Israel because they will upend the Jewish demographic majority. In other words, they will pollute the ethnic purity of the state. If they were Jews, the walls would come down tomorrow and they would be free to move wherever they wanted. They're there because they're not Jewish. They're there because of Zionism. That's it. Unlike the West Bank, however, the people in the Gaza Strip had not been demilitarized. They had not been crushed. They were unbroken. They had not had a Quisling regime imposed on them or been forced into futile negotiations that yielded nothing but thousands upon thousands of illegal Israeli settlements. Instead, the resistance pushed out the Israeli settlers. They were unbroken. They resisted their ghettoization and their dispossession as any dignified people in the world would.